Good morning once again. Today we are going to talk about the commodity in general and the capital-labor relationship. But before that, we should talk a little bit about the classical political economy in general. Marx was not invented political economy. He only continues the political economy tradition started with Adam Smith in analytical fashion, I would say, because even before Adam Smith, there had been political economy, works of political economy since the 16th century almost. But it was Adam Smith who started political economy as a science, so to speak, or as an endeavor that has a strong analytical background or analytical framework. What I mean is simple, actually. In order to understand the basic methodological aspects of political economy, maybe we should look at the basic characteristics of the political economy tradition. And it may be useful to see these aspects in relation or in comparison to neoclassical economics, as it is called today, and taught in different economics departments throughout the world, basically. We all know what economics is, what it is about. Neoclassical, the very name is different in the first place, of course. The name is economics, as a science like physics. And the basic problematic is the allocation of resources. We know the idea, right? Human wants are infinite, but the resources that can be used to satisfy these wants are not unlimited, they are limited, they are scarce. So because of this scarcity, we are forced to make choices, and this choice actually means basically the allocation of resources. How can we direct our resources in different sectors of the economy is the basic problematic of economics in general. And also exchange is important, economic theory is about the working of the markets. There are two sides of the market, buyers and sellers, demand and supply. So out of the interaction between demand and supply, there emerges a market price, and it is the market prices that allocate resources throughout the economy in different sectors of the economy. And the unit of analysis is, of course, individuals and their preferences, individual households and individual firms. Households try to maximize their utilities, firms try to maximize their profits, etc. And it is usually assumed that there exists perfect competition. There are many firms in the market, there are no barriers to entry and exit, of course. And all firms produce the same or homogeneous commodity. So these are the basic assumptions about perfect competition. And equilibrium is understood as a kind of static equilibrium, demand and supply equilibrium. And if there's any differences between demand and supply, there's no equilibrium. If there's excess demand, for example, the market price is supposed to fall. If there's excess supply, the market price is supposed to rise. So until when the equilibrium is restored, at equilibrium point, there's no change in that sense. Equilibrium is instantaneous and timeless, so to speak. It's static, basically, and at most we use comparative static analysis. If there's a change in the demand or supply in the form of a shift of the entire curve, then there will be a new price, but the previous price and the later equilibrium price are also instantaneous in the sense that the process of adjustment is not considered within this framework. So in that sense, it's comparative static analysis. Anyway, so, and also price is determined in the markets out of the interaction between demand and supply, and price is based upon utility, marginal utility, basically, right? So the value theory, as distinct from the price theory, is based upon utility, the notion of utility, which is subjective. And the market price is important. We usually don't talk about in economics values as distinct from prices because we assume or we argue in general that market prices reflect completely the values, the marginal values, of course. So as to the distribution, we have this marginal productivity theory, and profit is a cost item, basically. So each factor gets its share from the total product, gross national product, in accordance with its contribution in terms of the marginal productivity. Of course, these are all we know. On the other hand, within the political economy tradition, classical and Marxian, by classical I mean basically Smith and Ricardo. There are also other classical writers, of course, like Thomas Malthus and John Stuart Mill and a bunch of other economists, but they are not, by Marx at least, they are not considered as members of the classical school. The very name classical was coined Marx himself, mistaken. So basically, Smith started the tradition and Ricardo perfected it, so to speak, and Marx actually sees a continuity between the classical political economy tradition of Smith's and Ricardo's and his own understanding. Well, as to the political economy as an analytical construct, there are no great differences between Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, of course, in terms of their interpretation and also philosophical background, in terms of their methodology. Maybe there are some important and great differences as we are going to talk about. Okay, within this classical Marxian tradition, the name of the discipline is political economy. You know, economics is a political science. In the first place, it's about society, social science, if you will. Political here denotes the notion of the importance of the society or the polis, you know, Greek polis. Aristotle says human beings are political beings, they are political animals. So in that sense, economics is about politics. In the Greek thought, especially in the thought of Aristotle's, there are two important sub-branches of ethics. One is the politics, which is about the governance of the polis in general, and also economics. Economics is about the governance of the oikos. Oikos means household. Well, it is different from our own conception of household as a decision maker. It's more like a social institution. So economics is about governing the principles that are important in governing the household. Household is both a social unit and also an economic unit and even political unit in the sense that it is the base of the polis in general. So a good polis depends on good households and also in turn a good household in the sense of Aristotle's, of course, depends upon a good polis basically. So there are close links between polis and economics, and therefore economics from the very beginning actually is a political science. You know, the term economics was coined by Xenophon, a Greek general. He's famous with his Anabasis, the 10,000s, return of the 10,000s. They went to, they are mercenaries actually, and Xenophon is the leader of this group. They fight for different people for different purposes, and this work, Anabasis, talks about the expedition to Anatolia from the Greek mainland. So it's an interesting book, but as economists, of course, he's famous for his book Oikonomia. Well, I'm not sure about the name of the book. It's about oikos. Anyway, so economics comes from the Greek word oikos and nomos, nomos name actually. It's about laws, so to speak, that are important in governing the household, basically. Economics is about household, as we said. But from the very beginning, since the ancient times, economics is a political science. The term economics was coined by Alfred Marshall in the 19th century. So until the 19th century, the name of the science is political economy. And according to this tradition, political economy tradition, the fundamental problematic is capital accumulation as opposed to allocation of resources. So from the very beginning, methodologically speaking, political economy is concerned with growth and capital accumulation, and it has a dynamic character in the sense. And the analytical framework is about production and distribution. Distribution is very important. Ricardo, for example, in his famous book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, in the preface, says that political economy is a science that is concerned with the distribution of income among social classes. From this, we can see that also the unit of analysis within the political economy tradition is the social classes and their relations or structural variables in general. This is true for Marx as well, and Marx says that political economy is about interactions and tensions, even conflicts between the social classes, especially between proletariat and the bourgeoisie, whereas in Ricardo, for example, this tension was between the landlords, aristocrats, and who owns the land and who gets the rent as an income category. They simply rent their lands to the bourgeoisie. So the basic conflict is between the landed aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. Ricardo wrote in the 1820s, right at the end of the Industrial Revolution, but still there's this social tension between the landed aristocracy, who are strong from a political perspective, and the bourgeoisie, who becomes strong from an economic perspective. So out of this conflict, of course, there emerges the 20th century democracy, so to speak, towards the end of or towards the middle of the 19th century, actually. This political struggle between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie was ended with the victory of bourgeoisie. From a political perspective, there was no revolution. The British Revolution was made earlier, actually, in the 1648, started in the 1648 and ended with the glorious revolution of 1688, I guess. So after then, there was no political conflict, which could assume a violent form in that sense, I'm saying. Of course, this political struggle continues to this day, actually. Now, maybe not between the landed aristocracy and bourgeoisie, but between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, basically. Anyway, so everything is about social classes, and the unit of analysis is the classes themselves, and even a single individual capitalist is taken by Marx, for example, as he says, of course, as a personification of a social relation. We are coming to this. Competition is different from the neoclassical notion of competition, and it is free competition as opposed to perfect competition in the form of a pre-competition. We have to talk about the prevalence of a uniform profit rate across different sectors of the economy. It's a different conception than that of perfect competition. You know, in the perfect competition, we can say that, of course, in the long run, all profit rates must be equal among different sectors, but perfect competition is by definition about the entrance and exit of the market, the quality of the product, it is homogeneous, and the number of firms, etc. But in the conception of the free competition, we don't need these kinds of restrictive assumptions. All we need is the mobility of capital across different sectors, so that in the long run, there emerges a tendency towards the equalization of the profit rate among different sectors of the economy. Hence, we have a uniform profit rate in the long run. And this is an analytical construct, actually, maybe. And in this free competition, the market prices or prices of production, actually, or Adam Smith's natural prices, are to be determined by the cost of production. And these costs of production reflect the long-run equilibrium values, long-run normal values, so to speak, which are also determined by the uniformity of the profit rate across different sectors of the economy. We are going to talk about this as well. And the equilibrium is considered as centers of gravity. This is the metaphor that was used by Adam Smith. It's a Newtonian concept, as we all know, and Adam Smith also tried to develop a framework for social sciences, so to speak, that is close to that of Newton's. It's mechanical, it's based upon the notion of gravity and equilibrium, etc., etc. To this day, even economists are fond of these kinds of conception of the economy as a kind of a mechanical system, which is certainly true for the neoclassical economics as well, of course. So the centers of gravity are nothing but the natural prices that are determined by the uniform rate of profit. Natural prices are the cost prices or markup prices. And in these markup prices, the uniform profit rate is important. So from this, you can see that it's a long-run price and equilibrium price. So equilibrium, the notion of equilibrium is understood by the classical writers as different from the neoclassical conception. In the neoclassical conception, we have only market prices, and market prices are to be determined on the basis of the interaction between supply and demand, etc. But the equilibrium prices, or the natural prices within the classical framework, are to be determined only in the long run, and they are different from the market prices. Even in Adam Smith, for example, the market price is different from the natural price, because market prices reflect the demand conditions as well as supply conditions. But the natural price has nothing to do with the demand conditions. They are determined solely by the costs of production, including the uniform profit rate. So in that sense, the natural price or the prices of production, they are the same actually. The natural price term is used by Adam Smith, and the price of production is used by Ricardo and Marx. So, but other than that, there's no essential difference between them in the sense that they're all determined by the costs of production in general. In Marx, of course, these costs of production are also in relationship with the social factors such as the class struggle, etc. So equilibrium conception is based upon centers of gravity or the natural prices, the equilibrium values of prices in the long run. And when it comes to the value and price, there's a sharp distinction between value and price, and the value theory is basically an objective value theory in the sense that it has nothing to do with utilities or subjective valuations of individuals. It is based upon an objective notion, which is usually labor theory of value. The value of any commodity, exchange value of any commodity is determined by the labor time congealed, crystallized, bestowed in the commodity in question. We are going to talk about this aspect of the Marxian framework as well. And prices are different from, as we said, the market prices. They are natural prices. And the distribution is based upon, distribution theory is based upon surplus. You know, Ricardo says it is the distribution of surplus, actually, that is important in defining political economy as a science. So surplus is the difference between the cost of production and the selling price, actually, for any commodity. And this surplus is considered as the sum of profit and rent by David Ricardo, but as an abstraction, of course, as an analytical concept, it was considered solely by profit by Marx, basically. It's a kind of abstraction. And Marx was also aware that, you know, both the rent and also interest is part of the surplus because they are paid from the surplus created by the labor values. But for an analytical framework that he develops in Das Kapital, especially in the first volume, he assumes that there's no difference between, surplus is equal more or less to profit. And profit is not a cost item. It's a distributional category, actually. You know, profit is always a distributional category, of course, but in Marx, it is also determined by the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So basically, as you can see, there's a sharp analytical difference between the classical political economy tradition and the neoclassical economics. Maybe one of the most important aspects of the classical political economy is its heavy emphasis on production side of the economy, and there are also close relations between production, growth, and distribution analysis because they are all intertwined in the sense that profit is the source of all capital accumulation because profit growth process or capital accumulation process is financed through the profits, basically, and profit is a distribution category. So from the beginning of the analysis, we have this close relation, close links between the theory of distribution and the theory of growth or capital accumulation and production, of course. It is not the same with the neoclassical economics because within the neoclassical economics, actually, there are two blocks, analytically speaking, of course. One is the theory of exchange, which can also applies to the production side of the economy. because production is also seen as a kind of exchange with nature, basically. The principles are all the same, they are both results. The production process is carried out on the basis of rational choices of the respective units of decision makers, consumers or households and the firms, basically. Distribution theory is based upon the notion of the marginal productivity, which was developed by John Bates Clark in the late 19th century. He's an American economist. And here, this is a matter of debate, of course, but as to Srappa's analysis, we can see that Srappa wrote in the beginning of the 20th century an important article about the importance of the notion of this marginal productivity. He criticized throughout his life, actually, this marginal productivity theory, and he showed the inconsistencies within this marginal productivity theory, and also the indeterminacy of the profit and even interest rate within this theory. So in that sense, we can keep separate the two theories of consumption and production on the one hand, and the theory of distribution on the other hand. And theory of distribution is based upon the notion of technology, but the theory of consumption and even production is based upon the notion of utility or subjective valuation. So on the one hand, we have this more or less emphasis on the subjective valuations of individuals, but on the other hand, as it comes to the marginal productivity theory, our emphasis shifts to the technology. So this is a kind of inconsistency from a methodological point of view, I would say. But this is a complicated issue, of course, but for now we can say that from the very beginning, the neoclassical economics tries to keep these two blocks separate, basically, even unconsciously, I would say. Anyway, that's another issue, of course. Now, we can turn to the price determination, but before this, maybe it would be nice to talk about commodity, because commodity is the first important notions that we should understand in order to have a clearer understanding of Marxian analytical framework in general. Okay, in Das Kapital, for example, okay, let's see. Okay, this is the book by Marx, Das Kapital, his most important book, we can say. And Capital, the subtitle of Capital is The Critique of Political Economy, as we have already talked about it. Marx's work is both a critique and an effort in the political economy. So the first chapter of Das Kapital is about commodities, and the very first sentence of the work is this: the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of commodity. So at first sight, he says, everything is about commodity. What we call wealth, a classical political economist's notion, is to be seen as an immense accumulation of commodities, pile of commodities, basically, what is produced within a single period by the factors of the economy. It is still the same, right? In the classical tradition, of course, the term wealth denotes for what we call income, actually, gross national income and so forth. So this is another interesting difference, maybe not so important, but the idea is pretty the same. A commodity is the second sentence. A commodity is in the first place an object outside, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. So this is interesting. In economics, we don't use the term commodity, but instead we use the term good, right? Why good? Because it's something good, for short. A commodity, a good, has the quality of satisfying our want in one way or another. We have unlimited wants, remember, and we use these goods in order to satisfy our own wants or needs sometimes. Usually it's wants, not needs. So therefore, in this sense, it may appear that there's no great difference between the term commodity and the good, because they are both directed to satisfy some human wants. But actually, it's not the case. A commodity is a good, maybe, is a product or that was produced for selling in the market. This is more or less the technical definition of commodity. In the classical tradition, there's no such term as good, but instead we have commodity, the notion of commodity. In the first place, of course, the two are similar, the good and the commodity. A thing by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, luxury goods, etc., makes no difference. But here he's talking about utility because, it is first Adam Smith, actually, who talks in this manner. Adam Smith starts with the determination of value, exchange value, and he distinguishes between two forms of value. What is the use? Which one is one of them? Is the notion of the use value, which is utility actually, and the other is exchange value, the market price, so to speak. Well, actually not market price, but again, it's the natural price. The classical political economy considers the exchange value as equal to the natural price or the price of production. Price of production, remember, is determined by the uniform profit rate across the sectors of the economy. Of course, it's a long-run equilibrium price because in the short run, there may be, and there are, of course, differences among the profit rates prevailing in different sectors of the economy. So this is how the free competition is supposed to work. Whenever there's a decrease in the profit rate in one particular sector, the capital moves out towards the higher profit rate sectors. So in the long run, each sector will have a similar or the same uniform profit rate. So anyway, so the market price is different from the price of production, and exchange value is actually about the price of production or natural prices. So, and there's of course this famous, Adam Smith's famous diamond and water paradox. Adam Smith argues that the value of any commodity is not determined by the use value or utility, but it is determined by the costs of production, basically, prices of production we are talking about here. So this paradox is taken as for granted by both Ricardo and Marx. Actually, within the neoclassical framework, there's a solution to this so-called paradox. It's about the marginal quantities of each commodity that was brought into market, etc. But within the classical tradition, this paradox prevails in the sense that water is very useful. It has a high utility for human beings, even for survival. But the price of water is comparatively smaller than the price of diamond, etc. So that is the basically paradox. And Marx also follows this logic. The utility of a thing makes it a use value, but this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity, etc., etc. So you can read it. So one thing is to remember the difference between use value and exchange value. And in the neoclassical economic analysis, we don't have such distinction between use value and exchange value, because exchange values are determined by use values or utilities in general. But within the classical political economy tradition, these two are different, and exchange value has nothing to do with the use value. This is what Marx also believes in, and he tries to explain why this must be so within this first chapter. But the most important aspect of this first chapter, I would say that in the following lines, of course, a commodity, his assertion that a commodity is not a thing simply that satisfies some human wants. Of course, maybe this is the first condition for a commodity to exist. It has to satisfy some human wants, depending on the person or people. But even in this case, we can say that there are not great differences among individuals, but this is another matter of debate or controversy. It has to do with the theory of value in general as a philosophical notion, but for now, it is not necessary for us to engage into this kind of controversy. Anyway, a commodity is not simply a thing. It's a social relation. And for Marx, it is the social relation, actually, the notion of the social relation, that is the most important aspect of political economy. Commodity is a social relation, so is capital. In neoclassical economics, we consider capital as a pile of commodities or goods, actually, production goods we are talking about, produced goods that are used in the production process. It is called capital, and capital is seen as a kind of a physical object, which is the starting point of the inconsistency of the marginal productivity theory, actually, or the neoclassical distribution theory. Maybe we can talk about it later. But I'm sure you will be talking about this problem of the neoclassical economics in your history of economic analysis classes. Anyway, so capital is not simply a thing. Capital is based upon, capital is a social relation also. Capital as a social relation is based upon commodity as a social relation, and also these social relations, both commodity and capital, are based upon things maybe, but they are not about things. They are simply relations among individuals or relations among human beings in general. They are mediated by things, maybe. I have some goods to consume or to use as a kind of capital in the production process. By the way, within the classical political economy tradition, the notion of capital is considered as a form of fund that is to be used within the production, that is to be used to finance the production process. The capitalist has this fund as capital. It may be inherited, or it could be, assuming the form of credit, etc. But the capitalist must use these funds in order to carry out production. Some part of this fund will be spent on labor, and other part will be spent on machines and equipments, labor and capital. And in that sense, capital refers to both wage payments and also capital payments, so to speak. For example, in variable capital, in both Marx and Ricardo, maybe, we have this part of wages, or sometimes it is called as wage funds, the part of capital that is used to finance labor spending, basically. This is called variable capital, and the other part is called constant capital. In Marx, constant capital is about the amount spent on machines, equipments, capital goods in general, etc. So basically, but still capital as a social relation in Marx is to be mediated by the commodities, because we produce, or the production process is about producing goods and services, well, commodities. And these commodities, some of these commodities will be used in, again, the production process in later periods, etc. This is the capital accumulation process in its simplest form, basically. So it's a kind of social relations, and commodity is also social relation. And in that sense, it's about people, it's about human beings, it's about individuals in general. Within a capitalist economy, there are basically two important classes. There are also other classes, of course, even in Marx's time, in the second half of the 19th century, basically in the 1860s and so forth. There were also a landed aristocracy class, but from both an economic point of view and the political point of view, they were not important in the second half of the 19th century England. Well, there's a thesis that most of this class, the landed aristocracy, become integrated with the bourgeoisie through marriages and buying some aristocratic titles by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie has the money, the aristocracy has the titles, nobility, and so forth. So there's a close collaboration between these two classes. And it is even said that the city in London, which is still important from a financial point of view today, was the site, basically, more or less, of this integration between the bureaucracy and bourgeoisie and the landed aristocracy. So two important classes, the bourgeoisie and the working class, the proletariat. We are talking about the after industrial revolution society. Therefore, working class is basically the industrial proletariat. Anyway, so this class struggle is important, remember the relations of production and economic base, historical materialism thing in Marx. So within the 19th century English society, we have this conflict and struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Why we have such a conflict? Because surplus is produced by the proletariat in general, and some part of the surplus in the form of surplus value, of course, in Marx, is appropriated by the bourgeoisie. In Ricardo's analysis, for example, the surplus was created by the bourgeoisie in the land that are used in production of agricultural goods, basically, the beginning of 19th century England, which is interesting because, 19th century, beginning of the 19th century is the one of the most important, almost completion corresponds to the completion of the Industrial Revolution. You know, Industrial Revolution starts in the late 18th century, like 1760s or 70s, whatever, and ends more or less in the beginning of the 19th century. But Ricardo is interesting in that sense. He does not mention the importance of industrial capitalism, more or less. He still thinks that agricultural production is important, is the most important sector within the economy, and also he sees the production of surplus, mainly production of agricultural goods and services, goods, commodities, wheat, corn. Corn has also a political importance in the early phase of British society, industrial society, because the struggle between the landed aristocracy and the bourgeoisie is carried out with reference to the corn laws, the limitations of the importation of corn from abroad and so forth. So anyway, for Ricardo, bourgeoisie creates the surplus value, we should distinguish, or Marx actually distinguishes between surplus value and surplus. Surplus is a general category used by Smith and Ricardo. It refers to the difference between the selling price of the commodity and the price of production, mostly actually as a macro, so to speak, concept. Surplus, simply total surplus, which is the gross national product, social surplus, whatever you call it, is simply the difference between the value of output, total output, and the wages in general. So surplus is to be created within the agricultural sector, according to Ricardo, and some part of the surplus is to be appropriated by the landed aristocracy in the form of rent, because the land is owned by the landed aristocracy. Capitalists use this land, and in return they pay the rent to the aristocrats and so forth. But for Marx, the surplus value, which is equal in total to profit, again, as analytical abstraction we are talking about here. And this surplus is to be created by the proletariat, by the labor. It is, the value of any commodity is to be determined by the labor expended or spent or congealed within the commodity, and some part of this value is to be surplus value. There are three parts of the value of any commodity. One is the variable capital, the cost of labor in general. The other is fixed capital or constant capital, fixed capital in Ricardo. Constant capital, which is the cost of capital, equipments, etc. And the third part is the surplus value, which is the part that was created by the labor, basically, and it exceeds the value of the costs of production, labor cost and capital cost. So basically, the surplus value is created by the laborers, by the working class. And this surplus value is to be appropriated by the capitalists, because it's the capitalists who organizes production, etc., etc. So the difference in the form of surplus or surplus value or profit will go to the capitalists, and in the long run, of course, this means the misery, increasing misery of the proletariat and so forth. So there's an important struggle or conflict with the interests, between the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, etc. Anyway, maybe we can stop here and have a break.